Hello, I'm Chris Hay from the Iowa Soybean Association, and I'm going to be talking about edge-of-field practices for nitrogen loss reduction. Many of you have heard of 4R management strategies for managing nutrients, and this fits in within the 4R plus, or that plus part of 4R plus management. So some of these practices beyond just standard nutrient or fertilizer management. These practices also fit within a framework that we call conservation drainage. So what is conservation drainage? Well, where we've got subsurface or tile drainage, which covers a lot of Iowa and a lot of the Midwest, conservation drainage is where we try and keep the production goals of subsurface or tile drainage, basically getting rid of excess water so we've got good trafficability in the spring, and then also we've got that excess water out of the root zone so we can get good crop production and improve our yields. So that's certainly well demonstrated, but one of the challenges we've got where we've got that drainage is also a convenient pathway for nitrate or nitrate nitrogen that leaches below the root zone to be transported with that drainage water out to surface water. So with conservation drainage, then we try and bring in some of the environmental goals, and especially trying to positively impact water quality, and then fit within that intersection between those two. And so the practices that help us do that then are again, what we call conservation drainage. So again, why we think about this? Nitrogen and phosphorus losses from agricultural lands in the Midwest, again, gets in that surface water, eventually makes its way to the Mississippi River, and then out to the Gulf of Mexico. So annually, we get a dead zone or hypoxic zone that occurs in that Gulf of Mexico every year, and the size of that zone sometimes gets as large as the state of New Jersey. And so to address that issue, as well as other more local and regional water quality issues, the state of Iowa and other states in the Mississippi River Basin have developed nutrient reduction strategies to try and reduce the loss of both nitrogen and phosphorus, leaving the state by 45%. So it's part of those nutrient reduction strategies that a lot of these practices are being implemented to try and address those goals. Kind of what I'm going to go over in the time that I've got here is to talk a little bit about the mechanisms for how do we actually go about trying to reduce nitrogen losses. We'll talk through some of the different edge-of-field practices that are available to do that. We'll look at the relative performance of those different practices. And then finally, we'll go through a couple of decision trees that can help folks decide which of those practices might make the most sense for them and their operations. So again, kind of starting with the basic mechanisms of how we actually try and reduce the loss of nitrogen from these drained ag lands. Comes back to the basic nitrogen cycle combined with a little bit of the water cycle. And so we've got to work within that framework if we're going to try and reduce the loss of nitrogen that happens out of those systems. So there's basically 4 different ways that we can try and do that. So the first one is trying to reduce the nitrogen source, and that gets into kind of our standard 4R practices of right place, right time, right rate, and right form. And so if we can reduce the amount of that nitrogen that we're adding to the system, and then also that would leach or leap through that system, that's one way to reduce nitrogen loss. The second, kind of somewhat related to that, is if we can get more of that available to actually be taken up by the crop or other plants, then that's another way. And that's obviously the most beneficial way. That's the goal of that nitrogen in the first place, is to improve our crop production. And so if we can get more of that into the crop, more of that taken up by plants, then that's less that's going to leach below the root zone. Another one is we can increase what we call denitrification, and that's taking nitrate nitrogen, which is a very mobile form of nitrogen that gets in the water, and that's what leaves out through those drains. If we can convert that to nitrogen gas, that nitrogen gas is inert. It's basically 80% of the atmosphere that we all breathe, and so if we can get it back to that form, we've got that nitrate out of the water, we've got less nitrogen leaving with the water and going downstream. And then the last one is if we just actually physically reduce the amount of drainage flow that leaves through the system, then we're going to reduce the amount of nitrogen that would go with that. So again, 4 kind of ways that we can do that. Those top 2 are really, again, kind of fall in what we think of those standard 4R practices. Increasing plant uptake would be related to our cover crops as well. And then those last 2 are really kind of this plus package of these edge-of-field practices and other practices to try and reduce nitrogen losses from the field. So again, kind of the basics of how the different mechanisms work. Now we can look at the actual different practices that are available to do this. So the first practice I'm going to talk about is wetlands, or treatment wetlands in this case. And so if we can capture or outlet or daylight drainage water and put it into a treatment wetland, we'll get processes going on within that wetland that will reduce the amount of nitrogen that goes downstream. And so within that wetland, we're going to get some of that denitrification, again, converting nitrate nitrogen to nitrogen gas. A lot of areas within that wetland where that process will occur. We're also going to get some uptake from the plants in that wetland, and so that's going to take up some of the nitrogen as well. And then we've also got that free water surface that's going to be evaporating water, and so reduce the overall amount of flow that goes downstream. So the combination of those three processes then results in less nitrogen that moves downstream. If we look at some of the siting considerations where wetlands make sense, in general, this is for the Iowa CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. Most of the treatment wetlands in Iowa are built under this program, and that's looking typically for 500 or more acres of the contributing drainage area. So this moves generally beyond the field scale and looks at kind of larger, multiple drainage systems that would drain into this treatment wetland. Should be noted there are programs that allow for wetlands that treat smaller drainage areas. So if you're not in a situation where you can treat that much drainage area, there are some other programs that are available. But again, for kind of the standard Iowa CREP wetland, they're looking for something that treats 500 or more, 1,000 plus acres. One of the other considerations is the actual pool or the surface area of the wetland itself. We want that to be about 1% of the contributing drainage area. So say if we are treating 500 acres, then the surface area of that wetland pool is going to be about 5 acres at a minimum. So we need at least that much area for the wetland itself. And then we also need some additional area around that wetland to serve as a buffer. So that varies a little bit based on topography, but we're going to have a certain amount of additional area that needs to be there for that buffer as well. Another important consideration is we want some elevation drop from where we outlet that drainage water to capture it in the wetland to where the actual wetland pool is itself. And so as we fill up that wetland, we don't want to be backing up water that's going to inhibit or slow down the drainage coming from upstream. So if we've got a little bit of elevation drop, then that allows us to capture and hold that water in the wetland without impacting upstream drainage. And then one of the other considerations is we got low depressional areas that are wet, and often these are low profitability or sometimes even negative profitability areas. So if those are located in a spot where, again, we can capture some upstream drainage water, these are going to be good candidates to be potential treatment wetlands. And as part of the different programs that are available, these may be a way to actually get a little more yield, monetary yield from that land than sometimes what we could get from just trying to produce crops. So moving from kind of that larger scale practice down to now more of a field scale practice, the next one I'm going to talk about is what we call saturated buffers. So we've got a diagram here of a saturated buffer, and basically what is happening is as that drainage is coming down through the main towards an outlet, we intercept that with an inline water control structure. And so within that control structure then, we've got some stop logs where we can raise the outlet elevation of that control structure, and so water has to move up to that level before it will flow out. And then that helps divert water laterally into this distribution pipe. This distribution pipe is basically the same drains that we use to drain water from the field, but now we're actually forcing water back out through that distribution pipe within the buffer area, and then allowing that water to seep through the buffer back to the stream or the ditch. And so as that water does that, now it's going to interact with the organic material and the microbes, bacteria that are living in the soil, and they will actually do that same denitrification process of converting that nitrate nitrogen into nitrogen gas. And so by the time it gets back to the stream or the ditch, we've got less nitrate in that water, and we reduce the overall amount of nitrogen going downstream. And so Ideally what we want to have is some relief then coming down from the field into that buffer, so as we raise the water in that control structure and outlet it into the buffer, we don't back water up into the field and cause a drainage issue into the field. As long as we've got that condition, then it's kind of an ideal situation for that saturated buffer. We can outlet it in, push it through that buffer, not impact our drainage in the field, and really we don't have to do a whole lot of management with that system beyond that point. So this is just a picture of a field with a saturated buffer, and so again, water is coming down from the field. We intercept the main there, and then that control structure is moving water laterally into a distribution pipe within the buffer. And so, again, similar to what we see with wetlands, same types of processes going on. So the major form of nitrogen reduction is through denitrification. So again, as that water's moving through the soil, we've got bacteria in there that are feeding on the organic matter in the soil, and then they're drawing oxygen off of that nitrate molecule and converting it into nitrogen gas. We do get a little bit of plant uptake from that buffer vegetation as well, and then from just the evaporation and transpiration taking place in the buffer, we get a little bit of reduction in drain flow. But overall, the main process is denitrification. Some of the advantages of saturated buffers. One, we're going to talk about bioreactors next. This is a little less expensive practice than that. If we site it right, there's little to no management of the system other than just kind of the standard management that we have for a buffer of mowing or otherwise managing the vegetation within the buffer. As long as we've got an existing buffer, we're not taking any additional land out of production. And so again, that's nice that we're not impacting our land that we're using for crop production. We can usually pretty easily tack this onto an existing system. And then again, if we site this right, we're not having impact on drainage in the field because any excess water bypasses the buffer and goes straight to the outlet. We look at some of the siting considerations for saturated buffers, some of the things we need to make that system work. Obviously, we need either an existing buffer or a planned buffer. So if there isn't a buffer there already, but you're willing to put one in, right now, typically we recommend at least 30 feet of buffer to meet the NRCS conservation practice standard. More is better, but if we've got a minimum of a 30-foot wide buffer, that's enough to make the practice work. We need soils that will support denitrification. Fortunately, in Iowa, that's usually not a problem. When we get down to those riparian areas along streams and ditches, those tend to be pretty high organic matter soils. And so usually that's not a case, but in some cases, if we don't have high enough organic matter, then that's going to be a potential problem. The other thing we don't want is sand or gravel layers within that buffer. Otherwise, the water is going to short circuit through that sand and gravel as opposed to getting treated. As we mentioned before, ideally we want some slope coming down from the field into that buffer. So as we raise the water in the buffer, we're not raising the water back into the field. But if we're willing to manage the system, we can get away with flatter fields, but it is going to take some active management of lowering those boards in the spring to allow drainage in the spring, and then putting some boards back in to start moving water through the buffer after kind of spring field work operations. Another factor is as we're pushing water through that buffer, and more than had been going through historically, we want to make sure that we're doing that with a stream or ditch banks that are nice and stable. So we want good vegetation, good stable stream or ditch banks. We don't want them really deeply incised. We don't want them poorly vegetated and where we're potentially going to cause bank erosion problems by, again, pushing more water through that buffer. We can do this on different size drainage systems. Typically, we're not going to do it on just smaller 4-inch drainage outlets. We typically at least want a 6-inch or larger outlet, just because the expense of the practice wouldn't really relate very well to a really small outlet system. And then another key consideration is we'd like is that distribution line to be as long as possible. And so usually, the limiting factor is going to be we're going to run into a property line, we're going to run into another outlet, we're going to run into a depression or a swale or something like that that's going to limit the length of that distribution line. And so knowing how far we can run that distribution line becomes important. We typically like to get at least 500 feet or more of that distribution line And so if there isn't some other restrictive feature that's going to limit that, that's what we're looking for. So then moving on to kind of the next field scale type of practice. This one's called Denitrifying Bioreactors. Basically what that is shown here. It's a trench that we excavate. We line it with plastic, fill it with wood chips, and then we either choose to or we don't have to put a soil cap over that. So typically there's going to be 3 to 5 feet of wood chips and then 1 to 1.5 feet of soil over that. This one's partially completed, so you can kind of see the different layers. Once it's complete, then the whole trench would be full of wood chips again with that soil cap. And if we look at kind of a diagram view of that bioreactor, this is what it's going to look like. And so similar to a saturated buffer, we've got our main that's coming down from the field. We intercept that with the control structure, divert as much of that water as we can into that trench with the wood chips. And as that water moves through the wood chips, and bacteria that are living on those wood chips are going to convert that nitrate nitrogen into the nitrogen gas that's going to, again, seep up out through the soil of that bioreactor out to the atmosphere, and then we've got less nitrate leaving downstream. We generally have a second control structure down at the bottom of the bioreactor, and that one we use to control how long that water stays in the bioreactor. The longer it stays in there, the more treatment we get, and so we're trying to balance how much water we can treat with the level of treatment so that we reduce the nitrate as much as possible. As the name suggests, the main process going on here is denitrification. So again, it's bacteria living in that bioreactor feeding on the wood chips that are converting nitrate nitrogen into nitrogen gas. Some of the benefits of bioreactors. It's a proven technology. These denitrification types of bioreactors have been around in a number of different applications for a long time. We're just more recently applying them to this drainage context. Again, little or no land taken out of production. The footprint of that bioreactor is generally somewhere on the order of about 100 feet long and 20 to 25 feet wide. So generally going to be less than 1/10 of an acre that we need for that bioreactor footprint. So even if we don't have a buffer like we would need for a saturated buffer, as long as we've got 1/10 of an acre or a little bit less somewhere near that outlet, we can squeeze in that bioreactor without having to take much, if any, land out of production. There's generally a little more maintenance and management involved with bioreactors than there is with an ideal saturated buffer site, but overall it's still relatively low maintenance that's involved. Again, we can pretty easily retrofit these to existing systems, and similar to the other practices, if we situate this right where we've got a little bit of an elevation drop from the field to where the bioreactor's at, we allow for some bypass for high flows, and we don't restrict or push water back into the field and negatively impact drainage in the field. Some of the siting considerations that we look at for siting bioreactors then, because of the NRCS standard, it limits it. We have to be able to treat a certain amount of capacity of the drains. And so in practice, what that means is we're typically working with 6-inch to up to about 10-inch outlets. There are situations where we can scale to larger size systems, usually using multiple chambers of a bioreactor. But in general, most systems are going to fit kind of within that 6 to 10-inch outlet. So in relating back to drainage area, then that's typically somewhere around 30 to 100 acres of drainage area. We need kind of a workable outlet depth, so ideally we'd kind of like that main as we get near the outlet to be somewhere around 4 to 6 feet deep. We get too deep, and then that trench we've got to excavate gets really deep and becomes a problem. If it's too shallow, then we don't get enough wood chips in there to get the treatment we need. And so again, kind of 4 to 6 feet gives us a nice, good-sized bioreactor to get the treatment that we want. Some other outlet area considerations. Again, we want a space there near the outlet when we fit the bioreactor. We want one that's not going to be too low of a spot or subject to flooding so that we back water up into the bioreactor or prevent flow out of the bioreactor. We don't want water ponding on that and getting surface water into the bioreactor more than we need to. We don't want it in a waterway or area where we're going to get some erosion problems. If we do that, we may need to create a berm or some other way to to shunt that water around away from the bioreactor so we don't get it, so that bioreactor doesn't wash away. It's nice if we know the nitrate concentration or a typical nitrate concentration of the water that's coming out of that system. And relative to saturated buffers, it's a little more expensive practice with some decent upfront costs. And so it's one we're going to want to target to ones where we know we've got relatively higher nitrate concentrations. If it's already pretty low nitrate concentration coming out of that, it's not that we can't do it, but it's probably not the best use of our money. One of the other things that goes on is those wood chips will degrade over time, and the more that system is not kept full or wet, the faster those wood chips are going to break down. So typically we're going to want a system where we get relatively consistent flow over a relatively long drainage season. We don't want a system where we get a flush of water in the spring and then it shuts off and really doesn't flow beyond that. So the longer that drainage flow continues, the longer that bioreactor is going to last and the more treatment that we're going to get out of it. And then we kind of want to look at the relationship to other practices. And so if there's a wetland downstream or we're thinking about a wetland downstream, we probably don't want to spend a lot of money on bioreactors upstream because, again, the wetland's going to be doing the heavy lifting on nitrate treatment, and so it's probably not the best use of our money to be putting a bunch of bioreactors upstream of a wetland or some other treatment system. One other practice that a little different from the other practices is this idea of controlled drainage. And so we've talked about these control structures before. Controlled drainage really relies on those control structures showing up there in the upper right. And so again, we've got some stop logs in that we can raise and lower the elevation of that outlet. And so water has to rise to that level before it flows out. And so the idea with controlled drainage is giving us additional management of that drainage system. So most of our subsurface drainage systems, whenever the water table comes up above the drains, it's going to drain back out, and that's going to happen 24/7, 365. With controlled drainage, we can actually, again, manage that outlet, and so we can control when and how much water we let leave the drainage system. And so with that management, then, with this type of system, we've got the ability that we could potentially manage that water for improved crop production as well as the water quality benefits. And so the way this type of system would typically be managed is after harvest going into the non-growing season, we would put stop logs in that control structure up to 6 inches or a foot below the soil surface. And so basically, whenever we get water that would otherwise flow out, we're holding that back in the field. And when we do that, we hold the nitrogen or nitrate that would go with that water. Once we get to spring and we're a couple weeks to a month away from thinking about getting in the field and planting and doing our other spring field work operations, we pull those stop logs or boards and let the system drain out. So again, that gives us the drainage we need to get in the field on a timely manner, get our crops planted, get them going and established. And then once that crop's up and going and getting established, then now we can put some more stop logs in there, raise that outlet to typically 2 to 2.5 feet below the soil surface. And then if we catch some timely late spring, early summer rainfall, we can actually hold some water in that system. And that's water that crop can use when we go into the drier summer, and oftentimes we can use a little extra water. And so a number of studies across the Midwest and North Carolina and other areas have shown that particularly in a year where we get, again, good timely spring, early summer rainfall going into a drier summer, we can see a 5 to 10% yield increase from being able to hold some of that water back. And again, when we hold that water back, we also hold some of the nitrogen that would go with that. So it's one that it takes management to do that, and so you've got to be actively interested in wanting to manage the system and manage it for that increased crop yield. But as a side benefit of that, you can also get that water quality benefit. And so really it's the reduction in drain flow by not draining water when we don't need to drain water and holding some water back when we can that reduces the nitrogen that would otherwise flow out with that drainage water. So if we look at considerations for siting or implementing controlled drainage, one is it's going to work best where we've got a fully pattern tiled system. We can put it on systems that aren't fully pattern tiled, but it's going to have its most impact on a fully pattern-tiled system. So we either need an existing pattern-tiled system or one that we're planning to pattern tile. Another kind of consideration is what's the state of that existing system. Is it relatively new, or is this old, really old clay tile, old cement tile, concrete tile, and what kind of state is that old system in? So if we've got an older system that's not in the best of repair, putting controlled drainage in that may cause some other problems with that age of the system. So if we've got a good, relatively recent system and good repair, that's going to be a much better situation than a really old system that may be in need of some upgrades. Another is we're potentially going to need multiple of those control structures. If we've got a really flat field, we can reduce the number of control structures, but in most cases, we're going to need a control structure every 10 to 30 acres of drainage area. And so are we able to locate those on the system in a way that's convenient to actually manage and operate those? Another one is what's the impact going to be on neighbors? So if neighboring fields have some big depressions, we could potentially impact those some by holding water back in the field that we're trying to manage. Another is can we actually maintain an elevated water table when we need to? So in most cases we've got poorly drained soils, that's not going to be an issue, but in some cases, say if we've got a sandier soil on top of a heavy clay, if we put controlled drainage on that type of field, most of that water is just going to move laterally and we're not actually going to hold that water table. And so that becomes another consideration. And then a big one for controlled drainage is it really is best suited to pretty flat fields, typically 1% slope or less. We get beyond 1% slope, and we're going to start to need more and more of those control structures to make the system work, and it starts to become unmanageable. And then just going to throw in one other kind of emerging practice. This one right now is kind of more aspirational. There are a few of these systems out there, but certainly not a lot yet. It's one that myself and others in the Midwest are researching to see what the potential of this practice is. But we call this drainage water recycling, and the idea is we're actually capturing that drainage water in the spring, building a reservoir to store some of that water, and then we can use that as supplemental irrigation in the summer. So like we've talked about with controlled drainage, although we're concerned about too much water in the spring, in many or if not most years, there's going to be some periods in the summer where we're a little water short. We can actually use some more water to boost that yield and get closer to our full yield potential. And so that's the promise of drainage water recycling, is we capture the water when we got too much, and then we can put it back when we got too little or could use some more. And so there's all different kinds of ways that we can configure that system, and so we're looking at different options, but this is one here where we're using a traditional center pivot sprinkler system to irrigate the water. This one here is one, again, kind of similar to controlled drainage, where we've got a flat enough field. We could capture that water and actually pump it back into the drainage system itself and push it back through the drains and sub-irrigate, or basically raise the water table just below the root zone and let the roots get the water that way. So again, this is one that's emerging. It's not quite ready for prime time, but there certainly are some systems out there. But if it's something you're interested in, it's something to certainly keep an eye out for going down ahead in the future. So we kind of talked through the different practices. We'll hit real quick on practice performance. And so we're looking at nitrogen load reduction there on our x-axis as a percent. The dashed line there is the goal that we're trying to reach. In this case, 41%, the agricultural goal for the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And then we can put in the different practices within that nutrient reduction strategy. And we can kind of start to see some patterns here. So the brown ones here are kind of our standard nutrient for our management. So we get some benefit, but certainly not near the 41% goal that we're after. The yellow ones are our typical kind of cover crop practices, and so we get a nice bump in performance from those. The blue ones are our edge of field ones, and then the green ones are land use conversion, which tends to be our highest loss reduction practices. So again, if we focus in on those edge of field practices, these tend to be some of the highest performance practices that we've got, short of actually land use conversion. So where land use conversion doesn't make sense, Edge of field practices are where we can get some of the best performance short of, again, actually converting the land away from crop production. If we look at the cost efficiency or the cost effectiveness of these practices, we see another kind of benefit of these edge of field practices. So generally, there's some of our lowest cost practices just purely on terms of dollars per pound of nitrogen removed from that practice. So we can see here with our nitrogen management, kind of our 4R practices, it's a no-brainer. It's low-hanging fruit. We typically get some payback there, either through reduced input costs or increases in yield. So we certainly want to take advantage of those, but again, recognizing that on their own, they're not going to get us to 45%. We're going to have to look beyond that. And so again, edge of field practices, some of the cheapest in terms of dollars per pound of nitrogen removed. We get into cover crops and perennials. They're a little more expensive in terms of nitrogen reduction, but we also got to take into account there's other factors that go into making a cover crop or a perennial decision beyond just nitrogen removal. So there's a lot of reason that those make sense in many situations, and when we take into account all those other benefits, but strictly looking at nitrogen, edge of field has a cost benefit there. And so to wrap up then, let's kind of go through kind of the decision-making process around these edge of field practices and how you might think about which of these practices might make the most sense for your land or your operation. And so one of the easiest ways to start is to look at what's your primary goal for the practice. So if the primary goal is improving water quality, and that's a great goal to have, really any of the practices are going to make sense, but probably the ones that will make the most sense in this case would be a wetland, a saturated buffer, or a bioreactor. If you're interested in habitat as a primary goal, but then having water quality as a secondary goal, then we're really talking about wetlands would be a great one there for more area of habitat, or a saturated buffer if you want some stream side habitat as well. And then the last one is if you're really interested in having that enhanced water management and actually being able to manage water more effectively to try and increase crop yield as well as having some water quality benefit with that, then that's where you could look at controlled drainage as a great practice for that. Then kind of another way to step through the decision-making process is if we're looking for trying to improve water quality with an edge of field practice. First one is do we have an area, and ideally again kind of a low wet area to begin with, that we'd be willing to put in some type of a program with a long-term easement. If that's the case, then that's going to be again kind of the ideal situation to put in a wetland. We're going to get some payment for that program, for taking that land out of production, putting it into a wetland. We're getting the water quality benefit from that wetland, and we're getting the co-benefits of habitat and some of those other benefits that come from wetlands as well. If we don't have that, or if a wetland doesn't make sense for some other reason, then the next thing we look at is do we have an existing or a planned buffer that will go along that field edge, along a stream or ditch. If that's the case, then the next one we want to look at is potentially making a saturated buffer work. Again, there are some siting considerations with that, so it may not work in every situation, but that's probably the place to start. So if we don't have that, or again, a saturated buffer wouldn't work, then again, as long as we've got around of 1/10 of an acre somewhere near the outlet that we could put a bioreactor, then that's where we would look to try and make a bioreactor work. And if none of those work, then we're going to look for something different. So that could be cover crops, could be something else that we would look at to try and have that water quality impact that we're after. Some additional places to go for more information. These decision trees, as well as some other information about edge of field practices, as well as all the in-field different practices, including cover crops, are part of this whole farm conservation best practices manual. This was put together with Iowa Soybean and Iowa State Practical Farmers of Iowa and NRCS and some other partners. It's available at the Iowa State Extension and Outreach Extension Store, so you can get it free from there. And as we get back to doing more in-person field days and events, there'll be opportunities to pick one of these up at many of those as well. Another one specifically for edge of field practices is Conservation Drainage Network, located at conservationdrainage.net. And in particular, the resources tab on that site is a great place to go for extension and other outreach publications on these different edge of field conservation drainage practices. So just to summarize what I've tried to cover here today, not one practice is going to work everywhere, so there's no kind of silver bullet practice. Instead, we've got kind of a toolkit of different practices, and so ideally we can make one of these different practices fit any different situation. These conservation drainage or edge of field practices are some of the most effective and most cost-efficient practices that we've got. And generally there's cost share available to fund these practices. And so depending on where you're located, anywhere from 50% to 100% of that cost can be taken care of through those cost share programs. So with that, thank you for your time and attention, and hopefully you got something more on edge of field practices.